Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Mudassar Ahmed, President of the Concordia Forum. Welcome to this exclusive event discussing the case of Soleiman Faqiri, who in December 2016 suffered fatal injuries while waiting for a mental health assessment in an Ontario jail. Soleiman's case serves as an example of a man who lost his life in an institution that was supposed to take care of him. Now, years later, his family is still searching for justice. To start off with some housekeeping rules. If you have any questions, please submit them in the question and answer box. We'll be moving to audience questions in around an hour from now. This panel brings together activists, journalists, and human rights advocates from Canada and the United States to discuss accountability in the criminal justice system and the treatment of people suffering with mental illness. Today, we're joined by Yousef Fakiri, Suleiman's brother and founder of the Justice for Soli movement, Michelle Shepherd, an investigative journalist, filmmaker, and author of The Decade of Fear and Guantanamo's Child, who's also the story editor of Unascertained podcast discussing Soleiman's case. Yousef Zain, the host of Unascertained podcast, film director and actor known for I Am Rohingya, Fame and Fidelity, and The Righteous Sinner. Rabia Chowdhury, the author of the New York Times bestseller Adnan's Story and the host of the Undisclosed podcast, and Evan Soleiman, a Canadian columnist, political journalist, and the host of the Evan Soleiman Show, as well as the Canadian political news program, Question Period. Thank you all for joining us for today's discussion. Just a reminder that today's conversation will also be recorded for an episode of our podcast, PR Unmasked. Now, to begin with, for those of you who may not be familiar with the case of Soleiman Faqiri, here is a short video we'd like to share.
I was 9 years old. I was the oldest of five. Suleiman was the second. We were a very close-knit family. Right off the beginning, we knew Suleiman was special from the rest of us. He was more athletic than all of us, and academically, he was leaps and bounds ahead of myself and the rest of my siblings. Suleiman was enrolled at the University of Waterloo's engineering program. During his second semester in his first year, he got into a car accident. Shortly after this car accident, Suleiman was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And his life's trajectory would forever change. December 15th, 2016, it was a Thursday night. Two police officers came to my family's home. An incident happened with a neighbor, a confrontation happened with the neighbors, and he ended up being taken to custody. Suleiman was ordered by a judge to be transferred to the Ontario Shore Centre for Mental Health. He was supposed to be transferred to a hospital. And the only reason he didn't make it was because he was waiting for a bed. The two police officers informed my father that Suleiman passed away after an incident with the guards. My understanding is every single time when the Canadian mental health was executed with respect to Suleiman, he was taken into a hospital. The question we now have to ask is, why was he taken to the Central East Correctional Center, where he lost his life at the hands of individuals that were supposed to take care of him? According to the coroner, at the time of his death, Suleiman had 50 bruises on his body. A significant number of these bruises were blunt impact trauma. Both his legs and his hands were tied. He was pepper sprayed twice.
Was it common, Yousef, that because of his condition, he would have episodes that might lead to confrontations?
No, he was not a violent person. The thing with that day is that we weren't there. Nobody in the family was there, so we weren't able to comment on it because we didn't see that. People with schizophrenia, it's diverse. Some can get very intense, non-cohesive, non-understandable, whereas others, when they have an episode, they're just not able to make sense when they're talking. I always think about the end of his life, the last few minutes of his life, when he was asking for help, yet they ended up taking his life. It hurts. It's reliving that moments of violence that he went through. For me, reform looks like people with mental illness are not to spend a day in jail. When they're inside the system, it's very hard for them to get outside of the system. And the system can be a revolving door. People with mental illness should be in institutions with individuals that have the appropriate tools. It should not be a guard that should be dealing with someone with mental illness. It should be a social worker, a psychiatrist, a nurse. What we take solace in, what we take hope in, myself and the rest of the family, is for having Suleiman's story heard I do think people on the ground are working hard about changing and shifting the focus into mental illness, but I think we got a ways to go. People still don't view mental illness in the critical importance that it needs to have. His story will continue to be spoken about because he mattered. Mental illness has to matter. It is our job to show compassion. It is our job to show humility. It is our job to show respect. And it is our obligation to help them. My name is Yusuf Fakiri, and this is my brief but spectacular take on the story of my brother.
Well, thank you for sharing your brother's story, Yusuf. It was a very powerful video that touched on many topics that we'll be discussing today. On that note, I'd like to begin the panel discussion by starting with you. Can you tell us about the immediate chain of events that took place afterwards and how your family was informed about what happened? I understand there are still questions that remain unanswered, which must be extremely painful. Could you tell us more about the Justice for Soli movement and explain the key issues you're trying to resolve at the moment?
Absolutely. The chain of events that started after Suleiman's untimely killing, and let's call it that, it was a killing, based on the facts that has been reiterated, is that for the better part of almost a year, my family had zero to no information as to what happened to my late brother. The system is a very closed, innocuous, untransparent system that many people in our country of Canada don't know a lot about. And so the fight began right at the outset, Mudassir, right at the outset. And we were asking for things very simple. Here you had a healthy man, a 30-year-old man who lost his life, who 3 days before his illness, my father and I made arrangements for him to be transferred to the hospital. Is that 3 days after that incident, where we're essentially making arrangements. And so myself, I had a conversation with my mother after that night when the two police officers that came that informed us of Soli's death. I didn't know what to do. I was overwhelmed. There's emotions that I'm going through my mind, but at the same time, we're not getting any information. And so I went to work within a couple of days of Soli's death, and I started something called the Justice for Soli movement. And we deliberately called it a movement and not a campaign. And that is to say, campaigns have a certain window, shelf life, whereas movements call effectively for the change of a system. And that was what we effectively wanted to do. There's this fatal nexus that I call between the mental illness and the justice system here in Canada, that fatal nexus. And that's what it's been all about. And so, and we carved out a grand coalition across the nation, across Canada, where essentially Suleiman's story no longer became about Suleiman Fakiri. Today's event is a perfect example. The incredible talented panelists and Concordia Forum organizing this is an example of that it's bigger than Suleiman. It's bigger than the Faqiri family. It's a much more larger problem, and that we wanted to cast out. And I want to talk a little bit about that, is that like we've had doctors that were involved in an open letter. We had lawyers that have written op-eds on Suleiman's story. And, you know, we've had journalists that have talked about Suleiman's story since the beginning. And they've all served the purpose. We've had politicians both at our provincial parliament, but also in the Canadian Senate that have talked about Soli's story. And Soli's story has become essentially the catalyst for change, where many people across Canada are looking at Soli's story as an inspiration, where other families I've been in touch with from the West Coast to the East Coast of our nation, where they've stick to Soli's story as an example of getting hope, right? And that's what we're doing. It is painful. It is extremely painful. to know that the way that my brother passed away, that they killed him, that he took his life, to continue to fight when there is no answers, when we have the very minister who was asked in our question period a few weeks ago, did not even acknowledge Soli's death. To know that you had an eyewitness to Suleiman's death that saw everything, and 2 police investigations later still did not press charges because they said, we do not know which guard gave the fatal blow. When you have a guard that admitted that they did not follow the ministry's rule. But it all goes back to this idea and this movement of bringing systematic change. And Suleiman's story is part of that. And that's what we need to do. There's doctors, there's lawyers, there's journalists, there's different activists that have looked at Soli's story and said, and they've rallied behind my family in wanting to do this. And this is what it's all about. And the last thing I'm going to say with respect to this question, mental illness should not be a death sentence. Mental illness should be treated in the most compassionate, respectful way for people who are suffering. These are fathers, these are brothers, these are mothers. They have stories to tell. They should not be given to their families in body bags. And that's what it's about. Although we're in pain for Soli's death, and a part of us died that day because my brother was a special man. My brother was a special man. He was a gifted man. He was trilingual. He was an engineer by trade. But that's what this is all about. It's to leave a legacy for Suleiman. And to leave that legacy for Soli is building that better system for the many Suleimans.
Thank you, Yusuf. Michelle, moving to you now, as an investigative journalist, your job is to uncover what really happens in cases like Suleiman's. Were you surprised that a case like this took place in Canada? In comparison, in the US, mentally ill people are 16 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. In Canada, do you believe the treatment of people with mental illness, both by the media and by institutions, is better, or we're just not aware of other cases that they're tucked under the carpet?
Yeah, I think, thanks for inviting me here today, and thanks, Yusuf, for your really powerful opening. I think the simple answer is no, I'm not surprised. And I just want to clarify too, although I am a journalist with the podcast that was done covering Soli's death. I mean, that was the investigative work of Yusuf, who you're going to hear from, and his producing partner, Kevin. So I just came in as a story editor, but what they uncovered, it didn't surprise me. I mean, one of the first stories I did as a summer student at the Toronto Star, where I worked for 21 years, was to go into prisons. And I remember being a fairly sheltered 22-year-old going into Canadian prisons and being absolutely shocked. But so many of the problems that we hear about today, about segregation, about the inability to deal with inmates who have mental illness, the fact that they're even in prisons when they shouldn't be, I was hearing those, 25 years ago, 26 years ago. And that change takes so long. And I think in Canada, Canada does enjoy a wonderful reputation in the world in terms of respecting human rights. And much of that we do deserve. But I think because of that, internationally, and even among Canadians themselves, we sometimes turn a blind eye to some of these abuses that have gone on for years. And to change a system, it doesn't really get the kind of activism or the attention that it deserves. So we think we're a far cry from what's happening in the US and other countries, and often we're not.
That had to happen at least once. Thank you, Michelle. Yusuf, moving over to you. You've spent over 1.5 years working on a recently finished podcast series called Unascertained, the case of Soleiman Faqiri, which you and Michelle worked on for TV Ontario. Could you tell us how you first got involved in the case? What compelled you to create a podcast around the case, and how's the audience response been so far?
Yeah, well, as you heard Yusuf speak just for those few minutes, I'm sure everyone was extremely moved, and it was Yusuf. Yusuf reached out to myself and my producing partner Kevin Young, who he was interested in us taking on the story. And at the time, I didn't really know too much about it. I remember it being in the news, but I didn't know too much about the case. It really wasn't until we sat down with Yusuf, and I think it was like a 2-hour, 3-hour coffee that we had, where he told us the whole story. And he was in tears, and it was a very emotional meeting. So there was that element as well. Yusuf is very much the heart and soul, or the backbone of this podcast. But there were a lot of things that for us just really didn't add up. Some of the things that Yusuf alluded to. How Suleiman had over 50 bruises, cuts, lacerations, and the fact that no charges were laid to anyone involved, and that his death was considered unascertained on the post-mortem report. All of these things just didn't quite add up, even for us. And so we knew we wanted to probe it. We knew from an outside perspective, it seemed like an open and shut case, but there's so many layers that didn't quite add up. And so we decided we wanted to tell the story. We weren't sure what format, because we typically come from documentary films. And so we met with Michelle and sat down with her and told her about the story. And she, we were also toying with doing a podcast, and we kind of came to the idea of eventually doing it as a podcast, because there were so many things that for us, there were not many definitive answers, because so much has been held from the public about the story. So to be able to do a podcast where I can openly say, I'm frustrated. I was going through this case material and I couldn't find what I was looking for, because that was a lot of the story of researching this, was going through thousands of pages of police reports and autopsy files and very disturbing details about this case, and emails, and trying to find the answer to a very simple question: what happened to Suleiman Faqiri? How did he die? And so it was a very long process. And I think in the podcast, we sort of lay out everything that is publicly available to a general audience, and try to pick it apart, try to understand how something like this happened, how it could have happened, and how it continues to happen. Suleiman's case is very unique, but it's not an anomaly. It happens time and time again. Like Yusuf alluded to, it's unique because Suleiman, there's so many intersections. His mental illness, his identity as a visible minority, and all these elements, and being in one of the worst, most complained about jails in Ontario. How did he end up there? Why was he not sent to a mental health hospital? So all of these things sort of intrigued us, and the more and more we spoke to, we spoke to lawyers, doctors, medical experts, former correctional officers, who all felt the same way. None of this adds up. There are things that, we walked former correctional officers and doctors through the timeline of events that we were able to piece together. And time again, they pointed out red flags. This doesn't add up. This is against policy. All these things that for them was, there's a phrase that came up in almost every interview we did, where somebody said, it's not rocket science, to the point where we were joking with calling the podcast rocket science, because it was something that everyone kept bringing up. And so these elements that seem so obvious to, once you learn it, you're like, oh yeah, that you shouldn't do that when dealing with an inmate. An inmate, someone like that shouldn't be in a correctional facility, shouldn't be in segregation. Seems so obvious, but that's what we sort of do in the podcast, is very painstakingly go through the timeline of events to show the audience what really happened here.
Thank you, Yusuf. Now, coming to you, Rabia, you're arguably one of the most famous female Muslim lawyers in the world. You're also the executive producer of the documentary, The Case Against Adnan Syed. In the documentary, you discuss the role Syed's faith and ethnicity played in his arrest, subsequent trial, and imprisonment. With Suleiman's case, are there parallels you draw in terms of treatment of people of color and Muslim background by the criminal justice system?
First of all, let me just say thank you to the Concordia Forum for putting this together. Thank you, Yusuf, for giving me the honor of being involved and having some voice in this case, and trying to help spread awareness for it. The thing is, the parallels, I don't know, it's hard to make the determination whether there are parallels directly in terms of Suleiman's treatment in the prison or the fact that he ended up there because specifically he was Muslim, because I don't have, like, for example, court records and stuff. With Adnan, it was indisputable. But what is indisputable is that people of color are impacted by the carceral system in the United States, and certainly it seems like in Canada, in ways that other communities are not. And, one of the things that I think is important to recognize, when I was telling Adnan's story, when it was important for me to tell Adnan's story, it was not just important, and also this story, not just important so that people understand how the system works, so that our own communities can understand that these systems impact us. One of the most frustrating things, and I'm sure Yusuf, you and your family have encountered this, is having your own Muslim community say, well, when it comes to criminal justice issues or mental health issues, they're not really our issues. And that has always been a frustration for me. So, telling these stories shows that how I think it's really important. The parallels here is that these are lessons for our own community as well. Now, the other thing I wanted to raise was the point that we've had a lot of focus in the last few years about the treatment, about police brutality, with not a lot of focus on what happens once people are incarcerated and the brutality that occurs inside of correctional centers, where, at least in the United States, you're going to find mostly people of color who are criminalized for behavior that is not criminal behavior for other people. And they are subject to a system that is so imbalanced. And I mean, I'll give you a very simple example. The fact that that in Suleiman's case, his death is considered, the cause of his death is considered unascertained, and absolutely no one is held accountable for this, is so beyond shocking. In the United States, we have there's something called a felony murder. If I and another person are in the commission of a felony, and I don't have a weapon, I do nothing else, but that other person commits a crime in which somebody dies, I can get the exact same sentence as somebody who committed the actual murder, because I was there in the commission. So if this was a group of civilians who had attacked Soleiman and murdered him because he was murdered, then they would not have had this kind of protection from the system. But the fact that they're saying, because we cannot single one out, nobody is held accountable in what is clearly a crime, a man who has been shackled and who is completely held incapacitated is not able to inflict those injuries on himself. Just like Yusuf said, it's not rocket science. We know exactly what happened. We know what happened. He was murdered by these guards. So, the parallels here are that these are systems. I mean, I'm learning now more about the Canada system, in which accountability is nearly impossible, and that's incredibly disheartening and frustrating.
Thank you, Rabia. Moving over to you, Evan. As a well-known Canadian political journalist, I'd like to hear your views on the role of the media in holding institutions accountable. For instance, like in Suleiman's case, where a person died in a jail cell and no one was charged. Have interviews by journalists like yourself helped in obtaining more information about what truly happened to Suleiman on the day he died?
Let me just start also by thanking the Concordia Forum for hosting this really important conference. The podcast on Unascertained was incredible. So the people that worked on it was great. The person that really opened my eyes and heart to this was Yusuf. As you can see how he does that. It's his brother. And he turned Soleiman into, from a statistic, well, first, barely a statistic, because we barely count this, to a human being. And when I first knew about this, I was contacted by Yusuf, I think, 2016, right after it happened, and I wrote a series of columns about it, and we did a series of radio interviews very early. And what's different about this is not that Soli is unique. These were happening. Canada has a long and horrific history of mistreating a number of factors that are all, as we've just heard, very present in Soli's case. One, massive overrepresentation of people of color and Indigenous Canadians in our prison system. It's statistically well known. No one does anything about it. We've had all sorts of issues, whether it's racial profiling or carding, as it's been called. The incarceration rates of people of color it's well known, largely ignored. Two, we've had long histories of very horrific cases of mistreatment of mentally ill Canadians in our prison system, and we have both a provincial and a federal system. So we have prisons, much like the state, you know, you have federal and states runs in the United States. So massive mistreatment of people with mental illness, and uses of solitary confinement that United Nations have compared to forms of torture. And we've had very specific cases where we've had suicides, where young people who have killed themselves, who have mental illnesses, guards know about them, and guards literally watched them kill themselves and did nothing. So the idea that Soli's case was new and the system wasn't aware of it and no one knew, and it's all a system, it's absolute BS. Everyone knew these things were happening. The stats were there, the data was there, the cases were there. And what happened was our prison systems have a lack of accountability, number one. Two, there is what we all now know, an institutionalized racism. It's overwhelming from the data level. The culture is moving way slower than the data. Bodies are piling up, families are being shattered because the culture can't accept institutionalized racism, but it's all there. And then Yusuf, who lost his brother, and Yusuf and I have got to know each other over the last 3 or 4 years, and your family and your mom, and it wasn't just his eloquence and his humanity. It was that this was just a case that, as we've heard, it was so overwhelmingly unjust. The coroner's report itself was an indictment of the system. 50 horrific bruises and batters, contusions, and unascertained death. The evidence that kept emerging, the number of guards involved, the fact that the spit hood was on, the shackling, why they punished him and beat the hell out of him as he left the shower, why they pulled him away from the camera, why no one was charged. And every time more information from Yusuf's the lawyers involved in the case, and Yusuf's incredible work, two things emerged. One, the only way to get justice is if you're fortunate enough to have a brother like Yusuf and lawyers that are working that hard. And not everyone does in Canada. There are countless families that don't have a Yusuf. There are countless families that don't have the law. And then they rely on the media, the Michelles, and that have done incredible work over the years. And Michelle, for those of you not in Canada, is an icon of investigative work on this stuff. And we try to raise the voices in the media, columns and radio interviews and television interviews. In a perfect world, that makes a difference. It doesn't. It has to be almost a palimpsest. You have to layer one, another, and another, because the system is smart. The system relies on two things. One, flooding the zone. The next story comes and it goes away. The system knows that. 20 years ago, one big story on a show like mine can make a difference. Now they wait for the next event and they're gone. So they rely on flooding the zone and the collective amnesia. So it requires a relentless development, and that requires investigation, and that requires time, because the media, our big problem is we can't do anything unless there's new information. Oh yeah, that story, we did it last week. Oh yeah, the Star did it. McLean's did it. CTV did it. CBC did it. Done. Then you wait for the podcast, but that's 4 years later if you get one. And so you need new developments. And in the media, the horrible term is you got to feed the goat. And the goat is a terrible thing, because what that is a terrible metaphor for human beings who are getting forgotten. And I really give credit for Yusuf. It's the media. You need investigative journalists, and we're not investing in them. We need lawyers that are doing this work. We need more columnists. Like I kept doing it and having Yusuf on, but why does someone like the tragedy like Soli require a unique, incredible human being, passionate, courageous, tireless brother like Yusuf and his family to make that story? We cannot ask every family to do that. They need a system that works. And when the system fails, the media is a poor substitute. It is a help, but this is a systemic issue that needs systemic change, not Band-Aid solutions like a story in the media. It's a colossal failure of the system.
Thank you, Evan. Coming back to you, Yusuf, it's been over 4 years since you had to bury your brother Soleiman. How important is the support you receive from representatives of the media like Evan and Michelle, storytellers like Rabia and Yusuf in continuing the fight for your brother? Could you tell us what other individuals can do to help or get involved in the Justice for Soli campaign?
Thank you for your question, Mudassir. And thank you everyone for your kind words. Before I respond, Soli was the extraordinary individual. I'm just an ordinary man who was given an extraordinary responsibility. And that's what inspired me, because my brother, there was this profound love for him. And so I'm humbled by your beautiful words and your kind words, everybody. There's a quote we have, they say, justice will come, the justice will come. But the outcome of justice is not one person's effort. Rather, it is the outcome of a collective force. And that's very important. And that's what this movement has effectively been. And if we go back to your question, Mudassir, let's talk about everybody's role here. Let's talk about Evan's role, Michelle's role, Yusuf's role, Rabia's role, in terms of them being storytellers and journalists. Evan, for example, like Evan saw Solomon's case bigger than my family's case, bigger than my late brother. At the beginning, he was right at the beginning, invested in this at the beginning, and seeing that this case is, bigger than my family. And so, like, the fact that he gave me that platform, it made a world of a difference, because, when you're dealing with this pain, you're seeing these small wins. It was these small wins that allowed me to get the big wins, right? And, there's the credit that should be given to Evan for this, I felt like I was making a small little difference, because at the beginning, I had no media background. I had no communications background. I'm a policy guy by nature. I'm a writer. So that's so important. And then if we go, Michelle and Yusuf, if we look at this podcast and their roles, like, they saw gaps in Soli's story that my family could not see those gaps. They saw it and they filled those gaps effectively, profoundly, articulately, intellectually. And they articulated it in a way that we couldn't. So that's their roles. And it's much more, I'm not trying to reduce it, but there's that important role. And then Rabia was a key factor. Today's event happened. Mudassir, Rabia connected us to you in the Concordia Forum, and she served as a conduit. But everybody had a role to play in the movement, right? And Rabia, I wouldn't be here today if Rabia didn't connect me to you and in the work and our conversation, right? Everybody had a role to play. Where Soli's case is big, it's bigger than just like our country, but it's a certain issue that's beyond borders. And then, as I mentioned in my first question, there was doctors, lawyers, activists, academics, all playing a role. Families, right? Other families across the nation. Everybody carved out a space, and that's the part of the movement. Everybody was able to carve out a space to see this fatal nexus of incarceration and the mental illness. And that's why this movement will seek to, and I believe in my heart, and I believe fundamentally this movement will make systematic change, albeit it's been slow, but it will happen. And so as far as if we have the Yusuf Zines, the Evan Solomons, the Michelle Shepherds, the Mudassir Ahmeds, the Rabia Chowdhuries, we will get that change. We have to. We have no choice. In terms of, I want to be cognizant of everyone's time here. In terms of like how to help our campaign, we have emails to our members of our provincial parliament you could send. We've ran campaigns like that. We've ran open letters. These are some of the small but significant ways to help the campaign. Another way to help the campaign is, if you can donate to our campaign to help with the cost of the campaign and the legal costs, right? Because what happens here is that the campaign depends on all of this, right? It's that collective effort, right? Where everybody has to play a certain role in all of this. But at the end of the day, what's important for us to understand, Suleiman's story will not be forgotten because we've hit the soul of our nation. Because Canadians are getting it, understanding that this could have been our brother, our sister, and our son. Unfortunately, what Evan's comment was saying, and he was right, 150%. The system in itself doesn't want to change. But guess what? We will force the system to change because we We are the stakeholders. We are the players to the system, and they need to change. When you have guards that go effectively kill someone, and a police say that we cannot press charges because the eyewitness is credible, but the guards, we can't tell which guard gave the fatal blow, which Robbie articulated legally. It's a mockery of the system, right? What does that say? And the last part, before I finish my comment, imagine you were a First Nations or a racialized person, or you're a newcomer Canadian that did not, I was able to navigate through the system, but imagine if you're a single mother. How are you able to do that if you don't have the wherewithal? It's a very, I would like to call it an overwhelming system. All of these things require relentlessness, humility, and a conviction to know that what you're doing is for the bigger good. You might lost your brother, but know that your brother's story will have a better legacy when you make a small difference in other people's lives. And that's what this is all about.
Thank you, Yusuf. As Evan said earlier, Soleiman was very, very lucky to have you as a brother. I'm going to move on to you now, Michelle. You are the author of Guantanamo's Child, a book which focuses on the story of the Canadian Omar Khadr, who spent a quarter of his life growing up in Guantanamo Bay. Your book also explored why Canada is guilty by association. Torture methods used in Guantanamo have been widely condemned, but in Suleiman's case, a spit hood was used by the guards. Why are these dehumanizing practices still used, and has there been any progress in banning these methods in Canada?
I think it goes back to the theme of what we've all been talking about, which is essentially what it takes to bring about real change. And we've talked about making the public care about those who are impacted, and as we've all said, Yusuf has been this amazing advocate for his family. So thankfully we know that story, and there's so many others we don't know. It takes lawyers to get it out there, but ultimately what it takes is brave governments. And typically we don't have those. And even the governments that can be moved to bring about change, to change tough policies and to withstand which would the inevitable backlash of opposition, they tend to move slowly, and often what will happen is you'll get certain gains and then a new government will come in. So I don't think it's too much of a tangent to look at what we're talking about here in terms of prison reform to what I was looking at in terms of Guantanamo and what happened in that case. They're not popular subjects. In the case of Omar Khadr, there was no more controversial case than I can remember. Certainly, I could write the most benign story reporting some minor court development, and I would be bombarded with letters from both sides, just screaming at me. So it was a really heated case. It wasn't one that the government wanted to get involved with. So even when it became clear that he had been tortured and that the government had known about that, it took a Supreme Court ruling, another lawsuit to finally get an apology. That's what it takes. And again, I hope this isn't too much of a tangent, but in terms of that realm, we're seeing it again today with another controversial case, and that's the children and the women, Canadian children and women who were involved with ISIS, who are languishing in these camps now. No government wants to talk about that. And interestingly, Canada is behind even the US and other countries in repatriating these children. There's a case that 10 years from now we're gonna hear from. It's going to be similar to the Omar Khadr case, and our government's unwilling to step up and do the right, albeit maybe unpopular decision. So unfortunately, that's what it takes. It takes real change, political change, and political perseverance, and we just don't see that in Canada. We haven't seen that, and it's going to take that for this kind of reform too.
Thank you, Michelle. Yusuf, when producing your podcast, what did you learn about the situation of those in Canadian jails who suffer from mental illness? Was it challenging to dig into this story and better communicate the trauma the Fakiri family went through? What are the remaining challenges in holding the system accountable from your perspective?
Oh man, for sure, I learned so much about, like was mentioned earlier, this kind of narrative that Canada has as being, so different from the US and having a nice correctional system. I mean, it couldn't be farther from the truth. I think in the beginning, we were really focused on the narrative of Suleiman's beating, of what happened in that cell that day, and was he beat to death? All of these questions. It wasn't really until we interviewed an inmate who was on Suleiman's range 10 days prior to his death in a solitary confinement range, a man named Anthony Ouellette. And he started to tell us all of these details about the 10 days before his death and the conditions that he was in solitary confinement. And I mean, just horrific. And, it was the most response we've had to any of our episodes was episode 2, where we hear that story, where people were just, and myself included, unbelievably shocked at the depravity that Suleiman was subject to. I mean, his mental health was clearly declining and dwindling, but the conditions that he was placed in, stories of correctional officers banging on his door to disturb him, and while he was under duress, just the conditions of his cell. I mean, horrific stories from a fellow inmate, from somebody who was just on that range, and you hear that stuff and you think that you're shocked that this is happening in a jail, an hour away from where I live. And that, this is not the only case of it. So I think that was, hearing those kind of details and shifting our focus as we were researching the story of it's almost like the 10 days prior to his death were just as important as his death, because it was how he was treated. It was the conditions he was placed in. It was how correctional staff dealt with him or neglected to take care of him, which is their job. That's their duty. Whether he shouldn't be there in the first place, but it's their duty to take care of him. And I think that's been to go to your second part of your question, is what are the challenges of telling the story? I mean, getting people to talk to us, whether it's just to give a statement or a comment, like Rabia said, is impossible. Getting anybody to speak, to be transparent, as people like to say that they are, was we just did an interview with the chief coroner and chief pathologist of Ontario to press them on why Suleiman's death was unascertained, and we laid out all of the evidence that we found in our podcast that now the general audience knows, and we got nothing. More or less, they pretty much told us nothing. They could not answer our questions. So that's been really challenging, is getting our people in authority to answer our very basic questions. But there's also this concept of the code of silence in corrections. It's in the culture of corrections. We have it in Ontario, in Canada, it's in the US. It's this concept of you work in law enforcement, you don't talk. You don't rat, so to speak. And that makes it very difficult, even if you're, a law enforcement who sees something that is very troubling, that is against policy, that is illegal. There's this culture within corrections of you don't speak out, you don't say anything. And when we were doing the podcast, I mean, we couldn't, it was very hard to get any of the correctional officers involved in Suleiman's death to speak to us, or any staff, but after the podcast started coming out, we started hearing from former correctional officers, retired correctional officers, people from the jail, who started reaching out to us, to the fact now we're doing a bonus episode right now. We're working on a follow-up episode based on an interview we did with somebody from that jail, who just heard our podcast and decided to speak out. And so I think it's been amazing. I've been able to talk with so many former correctional staff, people on the other side of it, who we would normally not we would place outside of the story, but they have so much knowledge and so much expertise because they're there. They know, they see what's happening, and for them to break that code of silence, I think, is a huge step forward for transparency, and is something the government doesn't want, but is very important. So I mean, that's been incredible to see.
Thank you, Yusuf. Evan, what role does the media play in addressing cases which involve mental health, and why does the media fail to represent stories of people suffering with conditions like schizophrenia who are often portrayed as dangerous? Why are there misconceptions of these realities and the variety of behaviors they actually include? And what can we do to address this?
Just a couple things. Your question is really powerful because you're right, but I think we got to be careful talking about the media, because the world we live in is the landscape's very different. What Rabia does in her incredible work is very different than what we can show on the national news, or we do show. What Yusuf did in that Unascertained, the podcast series, what Michelle might do in a book. I went down to Guantanamo Bay and reported on Guantanamo years ago, but Michelle spent years and years doing a totally different kind of work that takes time. And so, the media is very different. And I think we ought to be very careful when we say what's in the media, because the media is fracturing in a very troubling way, because it's been weaponized by certain sides, and we all know that debate, but in a very good way as well, because new voices are emerging, and very powerful voices are emerging, and really important voices are emerging. And those voices are portraying people whose humanity was ignored. And those voices are portraying people in ways that their stories, their backgrounds, their rights were ignored. And why were they ignored? Because the media looked like me for a long time. A bunch of white guys. And we do our best. It's not, and I'm not going to apologize for my background, and everyone's got a story, but the ideas of privilege, the ideas of what stories can make it, the ideas of what voices can make it, were very much attuned to a culture that was funneled through very specific privileged voices. And we've got to explode those voices, and they've been exploded. And the voices of the powerless have not been heard. And there's no more powerless people than the mentally ill. And there's no more powerless people than the mentally ill who are racialized. And there's no even more powerless person than the racialized, mentally ill family who is then hidden by a system that, as Yusuf just talked about, is encased in iron, be literally behind bars, hidden away and forgotten about. And then, as Michelle talked about, when you do prison stories in mainstream media, there's a cultural response. Michelle wrote a book about Omar Khadr. I covered him for years. You cover Omar Khadr, doesn't matter what happens. You then welcome to a wave of left, right, up. You're in the conversation, and it's a very stormy sea of political agendas. And standing up for the rights of the incarcerated has always been difficult, because it doesn't sell ads. Right? The system's not built around telling stories about people who have broken the law, or the assumption that they've broken the law. So there's an extreme number of prejudices, presuppositions, barriers, cultural institutions, privileges, blindnesses, invisibilities that have prevented those voices. And then when you finally do try to portray it, you run up against old stereotypes about mental illness, which have been heavily stigmatized anyway, outside of all that. That mental illness itself is in the first stages of talking about it without stigmatizing it. So, Soleiman Faqiri, what happened to Soli, his tragedy was hidden behind decades, generations of cultural stigmas about who he is, the mental illness he had, the color of his skin, the religion, the system of prisons, and then the willingness of, quote, mainstream, whatever that means anymore, audiences to want to hear that kind of story. And that's changing. I think we heard Yusuf Fakiri so eloquently say it's changing. One of the great movements that we're all part of is, and it's been happening since the decolonialization of the world. And these movements we shouldn't say they're not inevitable. There's no deterministic, the arc of history bends towards justice, but it bends on the back of people. When it bends, it means some people break and some people bleed and some people die and some people are tortured and some people suffered and some people never get over it. So, these cliches about the arc of history bends towards justice as if it's this kind of inevitable march of time. It's not inevitable. It takes work and people and people suffer along the way. And we're here because one person, the arc of history bent and left Soli Fakiri dead in a jail. And Yusuf's listening to stories about his brother as a human being, and it's heartbreaking. So the media portrayals, I say this because I think about it every day, and I know Michelle does, I know Yusuf probably does, and I know Rabia does. When you're trying to get the portrayal of a mental illness and a racialized person and an imprisoned person, an incarcerated person right, for every story that gets it right, it's on the back of 1,000 stories that were never told and we got them wrong. But one of the great things that is happening is we're starting to move towards better, more accurate portrayals, and we're listening more, and more voices are happening. We need more of it. So there's a long road to go. We say mea culpa or media culpa. We have done a terrible job. But I only say this, the reason most of us are in this business, whether you're in the law, whether you're in an advocacy group, or whether you're in the media, is because there is no such thing as the final story. There are only stories of human beings and systems that are made up of human beings that are imperfect, and we fight to perfect imperfect systems. And the victims of those systems, of those imperfections, are real human beings. And so, yeah, mental illness is just one aspect of this. And you just think Soli was a victim of all those things in one moment. And society is a long way from recognizing that. But, I just say this, listening to Yusuf, but listening to Unascertained, the podcast, for me, who's someone who knew that story really well, was a remarkable feat of storytelling, where it vivified not only Soli's life, but it vivified the holes in the system. And just what Yusuf said, my job is often the snapshot. How did he die? But the podcast job is, how did they get there? And that's, we need all of these things, much more. And so, it's,
Yep.
Remarkable to be with these people who are doing just that.
Thank you, Evan. And I know that you're going to need to leave early, but thank you for your wonderful comments. Rabia, moving on to you, we've passed 1 year since George Floyd was killed by US law enforcement, and a blatant display of the American criminal justice system's continued failure towards people of color. What realistic changes can be made to address these failures, especially in cases which involve mental health patients? And are you hopeful about the future in the US?
Let me first say that there are so many layers of tragedy and horror in Soli's story. And one of the greatest ones is that he never belonged in that prison to begin with. In this country, and I'm sure in Canada as well, the prison system has taken the place of the kinds of psychiatric and psychological and counseling centers and therapy centers that are needed to address mental illness in society. The government doesn't want to pay for it. Private citizens can't afford it. And so we have substituted prisons as where to put people who, we are not able to treat and care for. I myself have a loved one who is a relative, and she's schizophrenic, and I have spent numerous nights calling police departments and jails looking for her when the family wasn't able to locate her, and terrified of the things that could happen to her, because I understand how vulnerable she is in the system. And so Soli's story really it just shook me when I first learned of it. In terms of what can be done now, I mean, when you hear words like defund the police, sometimes it gets the kind of reaction. It gets an immediate rejection as a reaction, because people aren't quite understanding what is really meant by that. A movement about defunding the police or abolishing the police is really not about completely abolishing the police. It's about allocating resources that are given to law enforcement that should be provided to other kinds of people in our societies to take. It should be provided to educators and social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists, and we should not have to always rely on the police to address every single issue. And I mean, you talk about George Floyd, we've seen this over and over again, where clearly mentally ill people who even have completely stripped in the middle of a street. And a person who's not even a professional can look at this person and say they're having a mental health crisis, and they get a response from law enforcement and they end up dead. This happens over and over and over again. And once they are incarcerated, if they're not killed, if they're incarcerated, they're not going to be getting treatment. They're not getting treatment. So, I think telling stories like this I think has made a huge impact in the last, I would say, decade on systemic change. I know in the United States, we're seeing a trend towards hiring progressive district attorneys across the country, and that makes a huge difference because guess what? DAs and state's attorneys decide who they're going to charge, how they're going to charge, what they're going to charge them with, and whether they're going to ask for jail time or not, right? So you have the right person making those calls, it can change an entire system. Literally, one person in that jurisdiction can make such a significant difference. But Evan, I have to say, it was really profound to hear you talk about the arc of justice bending over backs and labor. And I mean, Yusuf has been in this fight for 5 years to get justice for his family and for Soli. And 22 years later, I'm still trying to get justice for Adnan. And it takes an incredible amount of persistence. And while I appreciate that the media sometimes does give our stories voices, but the truth is, I feel like the only reason that's even starting to happen is because people like Yusuf, people like me, people like others have said, if you're not going to cover these stories, we're going to find ways to tell them ourselves. And the internet and podcasts and blogs and all these things have democratized the space. So we're like, we're going to be telling the stories. And then what I've seen happen is then the media comes looking for those stories. It's not happening the other way around. I mean, just Yusuf and I had this conversation the other day about how to get more awareness about Soli's story in American outlets. And I said, I know the struggle just to keep awareness around Adnan's case, alive is so difficult. And I said to try to do that with a case that's not even an American case, a Canadian case will be nearly impossible to do. You need a hook. It's the media. I'm like this, and the media obviously operates as a function of what people want to consume. So it's very long, arduous, heartbreaking, hard work. But the truth is, just as Yusuf said, you will see the change. Persistence will give you the change. The movement, as long as the movement continues, we're seeing the change. We have seen the change in the last decade with calls for police reform, with calls for defunding the police, social media videos from citizens showing us what really happens in communities of color, things they've been telling us for decades and we've been ignoring, right? And now you can't ignore it anymore. So it is happening. And I think that's the only heartening thing, but it is heartbreaking that it will always happen over the lives and bodies of people like Soli, like Adnan, like many, many thousands of others.
Thank you, Rabia. Speaking of justice system reform, the Concordia Forum will be hosting Attorney General Keith Ellison in a couple of weeks' time to talk about his fantastic work in the prosecution on the George Floyd case. So everybody listening, do keep an eye out for that and do join us. Now, I know Evan needs to dash. Before you go, Evan, do you have any closing remarks or thoughts?
No, I wish this was the last time we would talk about this. I wish this was one of these podcasts where we could all say, well, Unascertained was done, Rabia's work's done, and Michelle doesn't have to write any more books, and Yusuf doesn't have to advocate, and we're going to be back here. And we could all gather tomorrow, and we could gather with 10,000 more voices. And we got to do better. In my position, we think about it every day, and we're trying. Rabia just made, by the way, an incredible point. Mainstream media's blindness is being rectified by the voices that are emerging, and these kind of forums like the Concordia Forum. So I'm getting actually called to some mainstream media work right now but can I just tell you, the interview that we're doing, and this is profound, today in Canada, and I know this will be on the podcast, there was an unmarked grave of 215 children who were in a residential school in Kamloops, and their bodies were found in a mass grave that was undocumented. We've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 2015 of the residential school system, which was a cultural genocide committed by the Canadian government on Indigenous kids. And 3,200 kids were, killed or ran away, metaphorically. And now we found a mass grave, undocumented, of 215 children. They've never been counted. We don't know who they are. Their families, they may have just run away. Come on. This is happening today. I'm going to do an interview with the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations right now to put it on our mainstream media Sunday show. 10 years ago, that voice wasn't heard. Why? Because those bodies were under the ground. The bodies are coming up. The stories are being told, and it is important. And I'm leaving that because I have to go tell that story. And it's a heartbreaking story. I'm a father of 2 kids. There are families out there that never know what happened to their relatives. This is Canada, an unmarked mass grave with bodies as young as 3 of children who were torn from their families and sent to school. So we're talking about Soli. This has been going on for years and years in this country, and it's still going on. But Soli's story, as Yusuf said, is one more story, but we have thousands more to tell, and we don't even know them because they're buried, literally buried underground. So it is an honor to be here. I want to thank the Concordia Forum and these fine people. Yusuf, please give my love to your mom and your family, and keep up the good work. I hope we can gather again and maybe actually find moments. You never get justice, but you get moments of justice. You get moments of justice, and we hope Yusuf, we hope you find it. Thank you all. It's a real honor.
Thank you, Evan. Now it's time to move to audience questions. Firstly, we have a special guest in the audience who's promised to answer a couple of questions, and she is a Canadian senator for Ontario and a lawyer by training. Welcome, Senator Kim Pate. Senator, I believe you are with us now. You're an advocate who has spent over 40 years working in and around the legal system of Canada with and on behalf of some of the most marginalized, victimized, criminalized, and institutionalized. What was your reaction to Soleiman's case, and what can be done to reform the criminal justice system so cases like Soleiman's never happen again? Over to you, Senator.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to join you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg, otherwise known to many on Turtle Island as Ottawa, capital one of Canada. Well, first of all, I don't call it a justice system. It's a legal system. There's until such time as we have substantive equality, we can't even, hope for it to be a just system. So many of the comments I, would just, I want to acquaint myself and associate myself with all the comments I've heard go before. My first response was not again. What is unusual about Soleiman's case, as everybody has already identified, is that the family has, despite the stigma that attaches to people who have mental health issues and are criminalized, and many people know in my family, like so many of us who do this work, it's part of, my background as well, that the stigma usually means many people do not come forward because they are so, in addition to the trauma and grief that they're dealing with of loved ones lost, often don't come forward. And the unusual, and that's what's unusual, I say, about Soleiman's case, is that the family was there. And I was, barely a few years out of emerging from the inquest into the death of Ashley Smith, which took us years to actually uncover. And again, was because Ashley's mom and family insisted that the story be told. There's another inquest happening right now that almost mirrors exactly what happened to Ashley, and you're not hearing about it because the family is so stigmatized themselves. They don't want any attention to it. So I think one of the things we fundamentally have to do is insist that we address the issues. Part of what I see as the positives of defund the police, of all of the focus in the, particularly during this pandemic, on the systemic inequality that we've all known about for years, that many of you have reported on, written about, researched, advocated about, is that we actually need to address that systemic inequality if we are to stem the tide of those who are being criminalized and imprisoned. And it's not an accident that it is it's the intersections of those who experience the least privilege, the least power, have the fewest resources, who end up imprisoned. And I've been shocked at how few people, even when they hear about it. So it was great that Evan was here and talking about mainstream media coming on side, but I actually have been heartened by taking senators to jail. I often joke, not the way some people thought they'd be going, but a third of the senators have been to prisons. And 2 years ago, when we looked at the whole issue of solitary confinement, that bill, three things that the Senate did that virtually nobody paid attention to. In the end, we had, of all places, the Senate taking one of the most progressive positions in the country about everything from incarceration to segregation to mental health supports. And what does that have to do with what happened to Soli? Well, we took the recommendation that came out of the inquest into the death of Ashley Smith, where the jury said we should never incarcerate individuals with mental health issues. And if we miss and they do end up incarcerated, we should never, ever have them in segregation. The Senate said that, made an amendment to the legislation. They also said that there needed to be judicial oversight. If corrections wanted to put someone in a position of isolation, no matter what name they gave it, structured intervention units, mental health observation, intensive psychiatric care. If we did, talk to the audience, I'm sure we'd have 500 other pseudonyms for basically locking people in isolation, that they would have to go to court and establish the reasons. Why did we do that? Because right now, one of the hardest things, and all of the lawyers in the audience will know and on the panel will know, that one of the hardest things is to get the documentation. And Emma Cunliffe, an academic at UBC, has written about how the court should not continue to privilege police and correctional records and witnesses in the way they have historically. And that's at the crux of this as well, of course, and at so many of the other individual circumstances that have been talked about tonight or today. And that is that, they are the creators and the keepers of the record. And they, as we saw in this situation of Ashley Smith, many of you know that I instructed our counsel, who's now a judge, to ask every single corrections witness 3 questions. What did they know about Ashley? How did they know it? And how was she with them? And that created a record that showed Ashley had never been identified as having mental health issues till after she was dead. Now, in Soli's case, he was identified. He was supposed to be in a hospital and they hadn't transferred him. So what did everybody know about her? Almost everybody said they knew they were getting one of the most dangerous, violent women. And just as a backdrop for anybody who doesn't know what happened to Ashley, she was transferred into the adult system from the youth system. In 11.5 months was transferred 17 times, some of the most brutalizing experiences, but not atypical, actually. The anomaly is that we know about it, not what happened to her horrifically. And then how did they know that? They read the files. So that was the record created. And then we took video evidence, because she was one of the most videotaped, although many prisoners are, as we know again from Soli, but staff often know where to take them if they don't want to be videotaped. So we took the videotapes of what staff said was happening and then the official reports, and almost always they did not resemble each other. And then we asked, okay, what was she like with you? Well, every single witness talked about how basically she was okay with them. And by the end, we had journalists talking about how they loved her. They thought she was charming. She was a typical adolescent. So how do we get to that place? We get to that place because we have a system that allows us to not just dehumanize and stigmatize, but also dehumanize and treat as less than deserving of any kinds of human rights protections. And so the Senate also said, in addition to the judicial oversight, a remedy that Louise Arbour recommended 25 years ago after a situation at the Prison for Women in Kingston, that again, some people know about because we managed to get it out into mainstream media. But she recommended that in a situation where the way corrections treat someone amounts to correctional interference with a lawful sanction, that they should be there should be a remedy to go back to court and have the sentence terminated, or have the person released, or a combination of those. And so those were recommendations made as well. We created off ramps out of the system that were then rejected by the government. Sorry, I've gone on too long.
Would you be? I feel like we need to do a separate session with you on all of these things. You've raised so many important issues and cases, and I hope that we're able to have you back on to discuss them in further on one of these days. But thank you so much for your comment and intervention.
Thank you for all the work that all of you are doing.
A pleasure. Thank you. Now, our next question comes from one of Canada's foremost Muslim lawyers. She practices in the area of labor, employment, and human rights law in Toronto. I'd like to welcome Maniza Sheikh, who, unless she had a legal emergency to deal with, should be here. Okay. Right, I'm pretty sure that she has an extremely good legal reason for not being here, and perhaps she will join us later. But this gives us an opportunity to look at all these very intelligent and stimulating questions that we have in our chat box, and they're addressed to all sorts of different people. I'm sure the panelists have seen them. Anyone? But I guess.
Muniza asked her question, I guess, Mudassar, on the Q&A.
Yeah, Maniza has a question here. So maybe this was a question that she typed out before rushing off. The question here is, wondering about the challenges that Yusuf had in navigating the Muslim community on the mental health side of the story, given Rabia's comments around the lack of mental health awareness in our community. Yusuf Fakiri, I'll put that one to you.
Absolutely. And, Rabia gave a good context as well, and it's an excellent question. And look, I'll be honest, it was quite challenging. Some of the areas where Soli would go and pray, I was told by certain individuals that, oh, this case is can be a bit too local, right? But with that being said, there was some incredible. So there was this idea, the stigma, and let's be honest here, within the sub-Muslim community, and even within the sub-Muslim community, the Afghan community, there is a stigma. There's a derogatory term, for example, in my native language in Farsi, that was used, and normally, that stigma kind of was really put to rest with my mom. Like, she took that leadership and allowed Soleiman to be treated in the proper way, and when she said it needs to be my son, like, this is within a couple of weeks of him being diagnosed. That being said, although the stigma was very difficult and navigating through the community in many respects, what I will say is that there were some incredible leaders in the community at the beginning that were right there, and everyone else came along later. And some of them are in the audience that helped. There's an imam, Canada's first prison Muslim imam. He's gonna get mad at me. He's in the audience, but who's seen this, Imam Yassin Dwyer, who mentored me and taught me a lot of how to navigate, through the system, and taught me. And then there's Ahmed Atiya and Amir Ghawabi. Their comments and mentorship went a long way. They were from the Muslim community, and they allowed me to at least navigate, and the community came along later on. But I do think that our own community does have a lot of work to do. And Robbie would be better positioned to even comment on this. But yeah, that being said, they've been incredible, like, in supporting my family now, and knowing that mental illness disproportionately does affect people that come from war-torn countries, right? And anyways, I want to give everyone else time to respond.
Yeah. Your thoughts on mental health in Muslim communities? Rabia, your thoughts on?
I'm sorry, I didn't know you actually called on me. Did you call on me?
I did, but it might have got.
Sorry. Yeah. No. Look, yeah, there can be overwhelming stigma for a lot of different reasons, and I've witnessed myself over the course of my life in many families where it's clear where a child or a loved one does have mental health issues, that families are can be very resistant in addressing them. I mean, I've seen, and I think that's, you and I've talked about this, where they would rather it be a spiritual disease, or they would rather it be a possession, they would rather it be almost anything, because for some reason that has less stigma than, like, having mental health issues, because they think about, well, then what does this mean for my child's future, for their marriageability, for all these other things, for the children, what is this going to mean for future generations? So it can be very difficult. So it's not a subject that I think we talk about enough and address enough, like so many other things, like abuse and addiction and all these other things that um, absolutely exist in our communities, but we don't want to believe them because we tend, as a religious community, to want to address everything through religion. That, the cure to all is just praying more, praying right, scripture, things of that sort of thing. And I do hope the passing of generations will correct us on that issue, at least.
Thank you. I have another interesting question here. This is from Mark. As an advocate myself, I know only too well that justice officials and lawmakers move at a glacial pace, but they can react too quickly too. How can we help? What needs to be done now? Demand a public inquiry? What's next? Michelle, let me begin that with you.
There's a public inquest in this case, which Yusuf might know better when it's going to happen. Unfortunately, they don't quite have the same teeth as you would with criminal charges or bringing about any kind of political reform. I'm afraid I don't have a great answer. And it's interesting. I'm a journalist, but I've slipped over to the side of advocacy as well in terms of advocacy for journalism. And I'm involved now on the other side, trying to pressure the government to help journalists in distress. And I keep joking to the other journalists on our committee, it's a Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, that I'm like, oh, wow, I want to go back to journalism. I mean, it's just banging your head against the wall and the bureaucracy and trying to get through is really, really tiresome. So I don't have a lot of good experience. I don't have a lot of good advice. I know media can be your best friend, but for getting attention, for making people care, but it has to be consistent. And for all the reasons that Evan outlined earlier, it's difficult to keep that up, to keep that pressure up. And I really feel for families and advocates who are trying to do that. I think Rabia mentioned as well, though, that the voice is going to the community more. So, getting out there if it's not traditional media, getting out there on every platform you can. Ultimately, you have to make the politicians care. This has to work for them in a way, or they have to react, or it's going to be negative to them. Such basic advice, but it's just being in their face. I'm not sure. Others have better advice than that.
Yusuf, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like Michelle said, there is no perfect answer to make you go, oh, that's the solution. This is how we're gonna. I really do think, part of our intention of telling the story and doing this podcast was to get a lot of eyes on this story. So by the time the inquest rolls around, it won't just be Yusuf and his family standing at the inquest alone. There'll be a crowd of people who are paying attention. And I hope that by listening to the podcast that that you are going to be there. The inquest, the coroner's inquest, we don't have a date. As far as we know, it'll happen hopefully sometime this year. Part of our goal is with the pressure of this podcast to hopefully kind of push things forward. That was part of our goal with sitting down with the chief forensic pathologist and chief coroner of Ontario is sort of pressing them on those questions of when is the inquest going to happen. Their answer to us for almost all of the questions were it'll come at the inquest. All of these answers, everything you want to know about this case will come at this inquest. So we now have on their authority that when this inquest happens, the truth is going to come out. Will that actually happen? Only time will tell. But there are specific things that we talk about in the podcast that we don't specific pieces of evidence that we know are significant that we don't have. For example, there was an internal ministry investigation that took place into Suleiman's death by the Correctional Services Oversight Investigation Unit. A report came from that. We don't have that report, but we do know that several staff were fired after their investigation concluded from the Central East Correctional Center. So clearly clearly the findings of this investigation were significant enough that led to firings of staff. Why they were fired, what the findings were, what the evidence were, we don't know. But that's something that should come out at something like a coroner's inquest. And so by getting invested in this case, and that's hopefully by listening to the podcast, you kind of gain an understanding from beginning to end of everything that happened, that you can kind of, when this public inquest happens, you can be in attendance and you can be following it and pushing for these same kind of things.
Thank you. Rabia, your thoughts on what people can do to help?
Yeah, actually, thanks for giving me a chance, because I wanted to actually respond to the specific question. We recently in Maryland were able to get a law passed called the Juvenile Restoration Act, which effectively abolished juvenile life sentences without parole. This was an act that had been proposed a couple of years ago. It was not a bill that was expected to pass this year, but I joined with a group of, a fairly small group of us, maybe about 8 activists, and we just put in the time, and we learned that, I'll say in terms of Adnan's case, we've done a lot of work in court. We haven't done a lot of work with lawmakers themselves and legislators, and I realized that there are pressure points for them. It's all about donors, votes, and good and bad PR. And sometimes when you give people the opportunity to be heroes in public, in the media, in lots of different stories, they want to jump at that opportunity. There's also, you can, interestingly enough, Maryland is a blue state. It's a Democratic state, but we are not very progressive. But as the trend in the country starts going towards like more progressive policies and social justice issues, you see these politicians who have been very establishment are like, okay, how do we kind of glom onto this? How do we learn from this, and where can we go from this? If this is where young people are going, this is where the votes are going. So, it can take just a small group of dedicated people. If they can show lawmakers, listen, we have a database of like maybe 500 voters. It can be something as small as that can swing an election. There are people who run for positions where they have so much power, and they will run unopposed for years. So finding the right candidates to run, these kinds of things make a huge difference, and it doesn't take a lot of people. It just takes time. Doing a couple of fundraisers and pulling together a coalition and saying, well, you can have the bad PR or the good PR. These kinds of things are like just like shiny little toys for a lot of.
May I add something with that, sir?
Thank you, Rabbi. No, absolutely, Yusuf. I was going to come to you and just say, look, would you like to close off with your thoughts? Absolutely.
Close off. Okay. Look, Mudassir, and everybody, I wanted to, before I close, I just want to add something to what Michelle, Robbie, and Yusuf said. Yusuf Zine. I started the event with a lack of transparency in a closed system. The government knew about Soli's death. The minister actually resigned, David Orzedi, within 24 hours of Soleiman's death. Michelle reminded me about like the politicians, and Rabia's comment and Yusuf. So they knew, and that report that the government refuses to make public. These things are very important. So within 24 hours, the minister resigned after Soli's death. Why? Why did he resign? To this day, we have not been told why, but within 24 hours. So they knew that, they're aware. And then in question period, just a couple of weeks ago, they refused to even acknowledge Suleiman's death, and they fired some of their guards and they suspended. So they know. And to play this idea that we don't know, it speaks to the idea of the lack of transparent system. And if the government thinks that Suleiman Fakiri's story will go away, it will not. You have a family, you have Canadians across the nation, now folks in the United States and England, knowing, this story, right? Because it is filled with love, conviction, determination to build that society, to calling for criminal charges against the guards who killed Suleiman Fakiri. And here are my final words, Mudassir, is this. Edward Snowshoe, Tony Du, Mature Madat, Pierre Corleon, Ashley Smith, Abdurrahman Hassan, Abdurrahman Abdi, Jordan Sherrod, Andrew Loku, Regis Korchinski Paquette, Ijaz Chowdhury, Justin Saint-Amour, Cass Geddes, Suleiman Faqiri, Moses Amek Beaver. All those names I just articulated, and there's many that I missed, but I had to write to say these names. There was a fatal nexus of incarceration, police, and the justice system. All died across our provinces, across this country, and not one have been held accountable. Inquests are not needed for this. Fundamental systematic change are needed. These were fathers, brothers, sisters, mothers that needed their story to tell. And I pay homage to them because tonight's event is just as much about them than my late beautiful brother. And for us, anybody who's listening, whether it's across the Atlantic or across our border, the United States, or across the nation, Canada, know this. This story is about the soul of our society. This story is about a young man who lost his life in an institution where to take care of him, he was vulnerable. He needed his mother. He needed to be taken care of, not to be killed. And it is on us, paramount on us, imperative on us to change, to make that systematic change. Because if we don't, Suleiman's story will be a statistic, but I will continue to fight as long as I have my breath, the last breath I breathe on this earth, to fight for him. And that's what this is all about. Mental illness should not be a crime, should not be a death sentence. They should be held with respect and humility. Thank you so much, Mudassir, Concordia Forum, Rabia Chowdhury, Yusuf Zine, Michelle Shepard, the entire Concordia team, Evan Soleiman, Senator Kim Pate, and all the audience who's listening, who continues to support my family, who continues to give us the conviction and the support, because if it wasn't for you, we would not be here today. So thank you so much on behalf of my mom, both my parents, my siblings, and my late brother, sending nothing but love and respect to all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. This was a very powerful panel discussion, one of the most powerful we've ever done. Much food, much there for reflection, and I know that we'll all be involved somehow to pursue this noble aim of justice for your family. And on behalf of the Concordia Forum, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Finally, the stream of today's event will be available on the Concordia Forum Facebook page and will be released as a podcast episode in a couple of weeks. Thank you all for attending, and we hope you have much food for reflection, and that you're able to join us again, not just at Concordia Forum events, but at other events to fight for justice for Yusuf's family. Thank you. Good evening.